Please introduce yourself for our audience and tell us where you were born and when you were born, starting out that way.
Sure. My name is Scott Killough.
How do you spell that?
Killough. I grew up in Oklahoma, though I was originally born in New Mexico. My New Mexico family says I'm a transplanted New Mexican, but I'm 60. I'll be 64 years old next month, and I served as a Peace Corps volunteer from 1983 to 1986 in the Central American country of Guatemala.
So you extended for a third year?
Well, I stayed on a little longer. I did not formally extend for a full year, but in my second year, the program officer that I worked with, the Guatemalan, who actually later went on to become the Minister of Agriculture, and I was serving as a volunteer with the basically the government agency that was in charge of livestock extension. And in the second year, the program officer started a program to train and equip paraveterinarian associates. So these were farmers from rural communities, and we trained a number of people on basic livestock care skills, vaccination skills, etc.
We'll get into all this later.
Yep.
I just wondered about did
Whether
you
I
serve
extended.
a full?
Yeah.
Okay. Tell us where you grew up and a little about your parents and siblings.
Sure. I grew up in a small town up near Tulsa, Skytook, Oklahoma. Graduated high school there. I have a younger brother and a younger sister, so I was the oldest. When I was a freshman in high school, we moved to a small acreage outside of town, and so I became interested in FFA, raised pigs.
You raised pigs?
Raised pigs, and then went on and did undergraduate college studies, university studies at Oklahoma State University. Graduated there with a BS in Ag Economics from Oklahoma State.
Tell me about your parents.
My parents were my father, or my biological father died when I was quite young, and so then my mother was suddenly faced with the dilemma of raising three young kids at a young age.
Wow.
And she remarried, and my stepfather was originally from Arkansas, northwest Arkansas. My mother had grown up in here in Oklahoma, and so after my father passed away, we moved back to Tulsa. My parents met. My mother and stepfather met there and got married, and not too long after they got married, then we moved to Skytook, small town north of Tulsa, and were raised there.
Why Skytook of all places?
It was convenience, I think. It was a bedroom community for Tulsa. My stepfather was a mortician and a funeral director.
Okay.
And he worked in Tulsa, but he had grown up in a small town. He'd grown up in Siloam Springs, Arkansas.
Oh, I know where that is.
And he didn't really like living in Tulsa, so he wanted to get his family out away from Tulsa, so we moved to Skytook. It was close enough for him to drive, but a smaller town. And my mother, when we were younger, my mother worked as a teacher's assistant there at Skytook Public Schools for many years.
Okay. Where do you think you came up with the idea of Peace Corps and when?
Well,
Did you know anybody?
Well, yes, I did. So, I had heard about Peace Corps when I was much younger. I think there were advertisements on television or whatever, so I knew something about it. But I was in college, Oklahoma State, and I lived on the dorm floor for 3 years, and fell in with a really great bunch of guys that lived on the dorm. And one of my friends was, I guess, 2 years older than I was, and he had graduated with a wildlife zoology degree, and he ended up joining the Peace Corps, went to Tanzania, I believe, and built fish ponds. And
Did he talk to you about, before he joined, did he say, Scott, I'm thinking about doing this?
I don't remember, but I remember somehow, somewhere along the line, finding out about it and being kind of interested in it. And so while he was there, I wrote him letters, and he wrote back. That was in the days of writing letters.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So I got 2 or 3 letters probably over the course of a year or so from him about his adventures in Peace Corps. And I thought at the time, well, that's an interesting idea. I'm not sure that's what I would want to do. But then my senior year, as I was thinking about, jobs and next steps and what was I going to do, and I was applying for jobs and had a couple of offers, but just wasn't really excited at that point in my life about working for corporate America in the agriculture sector. Just didn't, Purina Foods just didn't excite me. And so I started thinking about my friend Alan, who was in Tanzania. And so I reached out to Peace Corps recruiter. At that time, there was no recruiter in Oklahoma.
Is there now?
There have been over the years, there have been. I don't know if there is now or not. I know at one time there was one up at OSU. Anyway, so I reached out to them. The closest recruiting office they had at that time was in Dallas.
Yeah.
So I had a phone interview with the guy from
What
Dallas.
was the main spark plug at this point for you to call this recruiter?
It was going to be an adventure, right? Isn't that what the newspaper or the advertisements on TV said? The greatest adventure you'll ever love, or something.
Yeah.
Something like that. So yeah, it was just an adventure. It was something that, I thought about. This is probably the kind of thing, if I'm ever going to want to do it, now's the best time to do it. I'm young, don't have any real commitments. I didn't have any student loans, fortunately, at that time.
Had you graduated from college at this point?
Had just graduated, yeah.
Just graduated.
So graduated.
So you were looking around, what am I going to do?
Right, looking around, what am I going to do? Got a job offer here, job offer there. Was like, man, this isn't really exciting. And so called the Peace Corps and, told them, put in the application. And they got back to me pretty quick. So this was probably in the winter of my senior year, so and into the spring of my senior year, which would have been spring of '83.
'83, okay.
And I remember he called me and said, we've got, he was excited about me as an applicant because I had an ag degree, right?
Yeah.
They love ag degrees.
Yeah.
The psychology and political science majors, they sometimes struggle with finding good placements for them. But
right.
he was excited for me, and he said, I've got two great opportunities for you. He said, you can work in a agriculture bank. I think it was a cooperative bank. And it was somewhere in a couple of countries in Africa. Malawi was one I remember for sure, and I don't remember where the other one was. So we talked about those jobs, those opportunities, those posts. And so towards the end of that conversation, I said, I wasn't really thinking to join the Peace Corps and then work in a bank.
Did you know what he was referring to?
Yeah, I had some idea.
I don't know what that is.
Yeah.
Agricultural bank.
Agricultural banks, they're basically finance institutions that make loans to farmers or to agricultural producers, right?
Well, shoot, I would have said the same thing you did.
Right, and if it had been, and I think one of them was a cooperative bank, which is a little more interesting in that the farmer producers are owners of the bank themselves, right? They come together and they form a bank. So, but anyway, so I said to him, I was really thinking something a little bit different. I said, I have lots of experience raising animals, livestock. I raised pigs myself. I worked on cattle farms growing up, hauled hay, worked on a dairy farm for a while. So I said, is there something like that? So he came back, he said, well, let me get back to you. So he called me back a few days later and said, he said, got a couple opportunities here for you. He said, livestock extension agent. I said, okay, that's good. So I'd be working with animals, but working with the farmers. He said, yeah. He said, we can send you to Morocco or Guatemala. And so I said, Morocco. I didn't know that much about the world then. I said, Morocco, that's in North Africa, isn't it? He said, yeah.
Yeah.
I said, aren't they Muslims? Yeah. I said, they don't eat much pork there, do they? I said, I'm really more of a pig farmer. And he said, okay, well, what about Guatemala? I said, they raise pigs there? He said, oh, yeah. I said, well, let's go to Guatemala.
Wow, just like that, huh? Gosh. Did you know where Guatemala was?
I knew because, that was 83. Central America was all in the headlines, not for good reasons. As you probably will recall, the early 80s was a very tumultuous time, a lot of turmoil in Central America. My mother was not happy about me going to Central America as a 22-year-old kid.
Well, were you a little bit, I don't know, worried or yourself about going into a place where you read about is in chaos?
I'm sure I thought about it a little bit and was a little concerned, but I didn't really know enough to know.
To be scared?
Yeah, to know how dangerous it was. It really didn't at that time. Now later on, of course, I learned a lot more, and of course, I learned about for example, the life of Father Stanley Rother from Oklahoma, who became a Catholic priest and who was working in Guatemala and was killed there.
Yes.
And of course, even before we got down there,
But you didn't know about Father Rother.
I did not know about
then.
Father Rother. I did not know about Father Rother at that time, no.
Okay.
And
So you made the decision just like that. And it sounds like you really haven't even had an interview yet. You filled out an application.
I had the initial interview. I did have that interview. It was a phone interview, though, and I never met him.
How long was the interview?
Oh, I really don't remember, Richard, but it was probably an hour and a half on the phone. It was a good interview. But like I said, when he saw my application and my ag degree and my on-farm experience growing up working, he was excited about getting me placed pretty quickly.
That's right.
And it did. It was. I mean, I applied sometime over the winter of '82, '83, early spring maybe of '83. By late summer, they sent me the offer. They said, you've been accepted to the Peace Corps. And so we were originally supposed to go to Guatemala in like September, early September, I think it was. So that was pretty quick, less than 6 months around 6 months from the time of application to actually heading off for your country assignment, which is not so typical for many Peace Corps applicants. But we were supposed to go in September, but in August there was a coup d'etat, a violent one. And so we were contacted. I don't remember how, phone, that was before email, obviously, maybe a letter, I don't remember. But they contacted us and said, yeah, you're not going to go to Guatemala just yet. So our departure...
And they told you why?
Yeah, because they said, political violence. So our departure for country was delayed until early December. Well, there I was. I had already graduated university, and I'd planned on going to Peace Corps. Didn't really have a job, so ended up back home. Moved back home with my mother, and went back.
Did your mother say that God is telling you this? God is telling you should not go.
She may have been, yes, she may have been. No, my mother was, there was a lot of fear and trepidation about this whole thing, but there was also a lot of excitement. She very much enjoyed the idea of me going off to Peace Corps. And, if I think about it now, she might have wanted to go with me, right, at that time in her life, but that wouldn't have been possible.
What about your stepfather? What was his?
Oh, he thought I was crazy. He thought I was crazy, yeah. But he was, my folks had by that time had just recently divorced by that time.
Oh.
And I talked to both of them about it, and it was one of those things, like a lot of my family, that they just didn't understand, right? That just the idea of, well, why would you get up and go to another part of the world, you know, to get a job down the road or whatever?
Yeah, you've got a job right there.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Oh, I really like what Barb said the other day. She said she was raised in Tulsa, and the idea of joining Peace Corps was akin, very, very much akin to running off and joining the circus.
right. Right.
Would it be that way? Kinda like that?
Like I said, both of my parents were pretty supportive, and I had friends that were pretty supportive as well. Some of my more distant family, my family out in New Mexico, I remember an uncle telling me, well, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard of. So yeah, it would have been similar to running off and joining the circus.
But the people who were saying it was crazy didn't know anything about it.
No, really
Yeah.
didn't, really didn't.
Now, at this point, you've already been accepted, you're going to go. Had you reached out to any RPCVs?
Other than my friend that I knew from OSU, and that's another wrinkle as well. So this friend Alan went off to Tanzania, was living out in the middle of nowhere, right? I mean, he'd write stories. He was writing letters back to me about, you know, hearing the lions roar and
Whoa.
you know, he was building fish ponds, but he got really sick, very sick. He lost a bunch of weight. He ended up in a hospital in Tanzania, and then ultimately got medevac back to the U.S.
Wow.
And he had some kind of intestinal parasite, but something really bad, and they ended up having to do a surgery on him, and so he did not go back.
So that was it.
Yeah, he served about a year and a half, I think, and then.
So he had quite an experience.
But you know,
until it got bad.
Absolutely, and he still to this day talks about what a great experience it was, and he really had, you know, was so sorry that he wasn't able to finish his service and stay longer and all that. But yeah, I mean, he ended up with some pretty serious medical issues.
Oh my!
But other than him, I really didn't know any RPCVs.
When you heard about how he had to be brought back to the States for treatment to save his life, I guess.
Right.
Did that have any impact on you?
Of course, I'm sure it did. But you know, when you're 22, you think you're invincible, right?
Yes, you do.
And so I thought, well,
that.
you know, I'll be more safe than he was.
So it wasn't a big deal. I mean,
It
you
really
felt
was.
sorry for him.
It really was, yeah.
It wasn't a big
And
deal.
even like I say, even he still had a very positive. Obviously, you know, I've talked to RPCVs that had those kinds of very traumatic, negative impacts on their volunteer service, and for many of them that really clouds and shadows their reminiscences of their experience. And in his case, it did not. In his case, he was like, you know, yeah, I got sick, but I still had a great experience and had a great time, and would do it again if I could. So, you know, so I took it with that grain of salt, I guess, as well.
Well, it sounds like the recruiter figured you were a really good fit, and the recruiter was very happy and proud to have made this placement, and he wasn't going to do anything to try to to give you any kind of ideas other than just go ahead and go to Guatemala and serve.
I think you're right. You know, and later, after I came back from my service, I worked as a recruiter. I worked when I did graduate school at Cornell University, and so I took out one student loan to get me through the first semester, and figured I'd get a job, an assistantship, research, teaching, something. So I get to Ithaca, New York, where Cornell is, and I find out that there's an assistantship for a Peace Corps volunteer on campus recruiter.
Sweet.
And it was a sweet deal. Yeah, it was a very good deal, because you could set your own hours. They paid full tuition. I think I even had a small stipend. Even had my own office, set my own office hours.
That's great.
It was good. It was the feather in the cap of all of the RPCVs that wanted that position on
No doubt.
at Cornell.
No doubt.
And so yeah, so then I got to look at a little bit from the other side, and you're right. I mean, you can tell pretty early on, not just the skills and background, that's obviously important. If you have a technical skill or you have some language skills, you know that's going to probably help prepare that individual to be a good volunteer. But a big part of it is about attitude, right? And what kind of questions do they ask? And are they fearful about what their experience might be or what might happen to them? And so as I look back on my recruitment experience, I think you're right. I think he was like, "Well, this guy's going to be okay. He'll be fine. I'm not going to tell him any bad stories to get him to change his mind."
No, and the other thing I was thinking about was that at that point he could have said, "Now, Scott, I've got 4 names of RPCVs here. You can call them if you want to, and they'll."
And he may have. I don't remember.
But if he did that, then you might have gotten one who said, "Oh, don't waste the time.
Yeah.
Don't do this."
It's like going to the circus. Are you crazy? Yeah.
Well, okay, so where we left off is it's been postponed until December.
Right. So I went back and got on where I'd worked before, Tulsa International Airport, and I told the boss, and I said, I'm only here for 4 months. Is that fine? And yep. So okay, fine. And so then we were then invited to meet in Miami.
When you say we, how many?
We were, I think that when we met in Miami, I think we were about 35, 37.
From all over the country?
From all over the country, yeah. I mean, I remember getting in an elevator in a hotel in Miami, and there was a married couple, and she was from California. He was from California as well, but he was Canadian citizen, but had served in the U.S. military, and so he was eligible for, he was an American citizen. And then meeting another guy from Minnesota and a guy from Kansas, right there in the elevator, yeah. And so we were there for 3 days, but it was not a particularly pleasant experience. There were some good sides to it. They had brought a couple of volunteers, active volunteers, up to talk about their experience, and getting to know them and hearing them tell their stories and talking to them was fantastic. But the country director for Guatemala, and I won't mention his name, at that time, he came to Miami, and he said, "Now, I usually don't come for these, I just let somebody else come." But he said, "I'm telling you right now, Guatemala is a dangerous place. I don't want you coming to Guatemala. I don't want to be responsible for you.
Whoa.
This is not my decision. This is a Washington thing. That damn Kissinger Commission,"
Wow.
Because the year before they had sent down former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to try to figure out what are the ways in which American soft power might be brought to bear as an influencer to bring about change in Central America. And one of their recommendations was that they said that you should triple the size of the Peace Corps volunteer footprint in Central America. So Washington started doing that, and they were, ramping up. So our group was about 35. Usually the groups were like 20, 25. So already with our group, they were beginning to start to ramp it up. And I remember them talking very serious over those 3-4 days about.
Before we go on to the other part of the initial training, what impact did this country director's talk have on, and warning, have on you and the others?
I mean, we talked about it. What I found interesting is there were about 3 or 4 in my group. Most of us were like me, really didn't have a good understanding of what was going on politically in Central America. We were just excited about the opportunity, right? But 2 volunteers who are still very, very good friends, both were a lot more informed. They were political science majors at university. They read and studied about Central America. And so we talked about it, in the evening over beers or sitting around in the pool or whatever. And then there was a third fellow who was, he was a political science major from UC Berkeley. But the two friends, They talked about it quietly, right? Or let's say over beers or sitting around the pool in the evening. This fellow from Berkeley, he was very vocal about it in the small group discussions. And I'm going to go to Central America. I want to find out what the truth is. I'm going to get down there and, figure this out. And at the end of the 3 days, he was not asked to go to Guatemala.
Oh.
So they decided.
The firebrand was.
Yeah, as we referred to him as, he was berserkly. Was the nickname he got in those 3 days. But no, so during that time, we listening to them talk about, a more nuanced understanding, even though they didn't have any direct understanding of what was going on, I think helped everybody to feel a little bit fearful, no doubt. I mean, it was serious. I mean, and it was being presented to us in a serious way. But I think we were still very enthusiastic. And even the volunteers, the couple of volunteers that had come up for that those 3 days, they talked about, they conveyed to us a strong assurance that even though Guatemala was a dangerous place, but that Peace Corps had a good feel for what was happening in the country, and that Peace Corps country staff, the safety and security of volunteers was paramount. And so I think that helped to give us some assurances that, okay, this is not the safest place in the world, but we're not going to necessarily be putting ourselves in harm's way.
You didn't have the opinion at that point then that some of the violence was targeted especially at Americans?
Did not.
Okay.
Did not. Yeah. Did
Well,
not.
so you didn't need to worry about that.
But in fact, that was
That was
true.
Yeah, as you
learned
later.
as we learned later. Yeah.
Okay. So how long did you stay in Miami?
Oh, we were there like 3 or 4 days.
3 or 4.
What they call staging before they send you off. And I think there was one other in the group. I think a woman, an older woman, who decided, hearing the talk about the danger, decided that wasn't a good fit for her, and this colleague from Berkeley, who was uninvited. So there were 2 or 3 that didn't proceed, but yeah, we all got on a plane and flew into Guatemala City.
Did you ever hear the word deselected?
Deselected, yes.
Yes. Did you?
Yes.
Was this guy deselected?
He was deselected, yeah. Berserkly was deselected.
Did he understand that he was deselected?
He did. It was funny. It was towards the end of the 3 days, and we were asked to come in, form a big circle, right? I think we maybe even had been asked to hold hands. I don't remember, but stand in a circle, and this was our final chance to, to make a decision. Close your eyes, think about it, just think about yourself, your safety, etc. And after that few minutes, when we opened our eyes, he had been exited from the room.
Ooh.
So he was actively deselected, I think.
Well, I just bring that up because younger volunteers that I've talked to over the years had never heard that.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, they'd never heard that
Yeah.
that word before.
Yeah.
So they don't do that
Right.
anymore.
Right.
But anyway, gosh. So how many came and how many and everybody remained except one?
I think there was maybe one other, like I say, older woman who decided that it was. So we were still about 32, 33, something like that.
Did you feel like you were kind of close-knit group or
we were already pretty good friends, yeah, at the end of those 3 or 4 days. I mean, it was intense, right? I mean, especially I think because of this mood that was set by the country director showing up and not being happy that we were coming.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What did they tell you about the language? The language is English, right?
No, Guatemala's Spanish-speaking.
Oh, that's right. I was thinking of Ghana.
Spanish-speaking.
No.
Yeah, they talked about language. They said that the language program is very good, which, as it turned out, once we got down there, found that out to be very true. It was, I mean, I was super impressed by the language instructors, all Guatemalans. None of them considered themselves to be fluent in English at all. And in fact, the language, once we started the training, The language classes, language instruction was in Spanish from day one. And
No English, or very little.
very little. Occasionally, one of the teachers might say a phrase or a word in English just to communicate the learning point.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, it was almost entirely in Spanish.
So you were in Guatemala City, and then what? Did you disperse, or did you stay together?
No, so we flew into Guatemala. They put us on a bus and said, we're going to drive about an hour to Antigua, Guatemala, which is the original colonial capital city of Guatemala. And our training center is outside of Antigua. But tonight we're going to put you up in a hotel in Antigua, and then tomorrow you'll go to the training center, and tomorrow night you'll be assigned, or tomorrow afternoon, at the end of the day, you'll be assigned to your host families.
So everybody was going to stay with a host family.
Everybody stayed with a host family,
Okay.
right? And then we were going to spend 3 months in this training program. The training program was 3 aspects. It was language, of course, language instruction. Second was what they called technical training. Livestock extension agents, we were going to learn what vaccines were available, what were the animal diseases that were prevalent in Guatemala, things like that. And then the third area was what they called cross-cultural training, where you learn about the do's and don'ts of the culture. You learn how to swear in the local language.
That's important.
Yeah, those kinds of things. Yeah. So, but what was interesting on that first day? I mean, we flew into Guatemala City. We were on this bus, and so we're headed to Antigua, and we're laughing and having a good time, and excited. And we're pulling into Antigua about dusk, and didn't know it at the time, but Antigua was a colonial city, beautiful colonial city, but that had been severely damaged 200 years ago as a result of earthquakes. So there were a lot of old buildings that were ruins of the original Spanish colonial buildings. So they were kind of torn down, and
So they were still there in ruins.
They're still there, but a lot of ruins. Now, some of them had been rebuilt, but there were still a lot of ruins. So we're driving into town, and we start seeing these crumbled, falling down buildings, right, looking like they've been bombed out or something. And then all of a sudden, we noticed that the sky is filled with smoke.
Ooh.
And we're like, what, is this a war zone? Are we really going into, this is a war zone? Well, what we found out the next day was that was December 7th, which of course here is known as Pearl Harbor Day, but there it's Dia del Diablo, Day of the Devil. And the tradition is on the Day of the Devil, you sweep out your house and you sweep all of the trash and the dust out into the street, you pile it up and you burn it.
Oh.
And then that's a way the smoke will keep the devil away from your house for another year.
Okay.
But as we were driving in, we're seeing all this smoke and we're seeing all these burned out buildings, and we're like, oh my goodness, we're in a war zone.
Ominous, really ominous. Wow. Any day, any time now, there's going to be an explosion in the road.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, gosh. So you were together for 3 months, but you had host families.
So that's, like I said, after that first day, well, on the first day, what they did in the training center was basically just kind of, orientation and showing us around. Mm-hmm. And then everybody had their individual Spanish test. So one by one, we were taken off with a Spanish teacher and sat down, and the Spanish teacher started a conversation. And the objective was to see how far into the conversation you could get. Well, I didn't get very far. My 2 years of high school Spanish from Skytuke High School did not get me very far. But so then by the end of that day, we were all assigned, we were classified, because there were 2 or 3 in the group who had Spanish degrees from university, and whose Spanish was pretty good.
So they had a big advantage.
Yeah. Oh yeah, so they They were in one group, and then and I was kind of in the middle, and then we had an older couple. He was ex-military, and his wife, and they struggled. Actually, they weren't able to complete the Spanish requirement, because one of the things they told us on that day is you're going to have, by the end of the 3 months, the Spanish language program is very intensive and the instructors are good, but because of the context of Guatemala right now, you have to have what was known as a 2+ FSI, the Foreign
I know what
Service
that is.
Institute. You had to have a 2+ in Spanish.
Out of 5, right?
Out of 5.
Yeah.
Out of 5. 5 is a fluent speaker with a native accent, and 0 is obviously nothing. And so, but you had to have a 2. Was it 2 or 2+? I can't remember now.
I think it's 2+.
I think it was a 2+.
Yeah.
And so this one couple didn't make it, and I think there was maybe 1 or 2 others that didn't make it because of language. But most of us made it through the language because the instructors were just fantastic.
So they were sent home, the ones that didn't get the 2+?
I know the married couple, he was ex-military, and he was a bit of a character. I think he threw a bit of a fit, and they got reassigned to Belize, which is English speaking and neighboring Central American country. And I think one of the others, well, I know one of the other older gentlemen, really nice guy, was a 30-year career beekeeper. Vince was his name. He's from upstate New York. Great guy, but he just could not learn Spanish. So he did end up having to go home. But we had a really big, among the technical group, in our group, one of the biggest ones was the beekeeping group, because at that time in '83, the Africanized bees were coming up from Brazil, where they had been let loose, and they were making their way to North America. And so Guatemala, Honduras, and they didn't have Peace Corps. El Salvador did not have a Peace Corps program at that time because they were really in the Civil War. But Guatemala and Honduras both had pretty big beekeeping programs to try and avert the Africanized bees from coming north. They didn't work, but anyway, so we had a number of beekeepers. And there they were, and I get it. I mean, Vince would have been a danger to his own safety and security with his lack of Spanish had he stayed. But there he was, the most experienced beekeeper. He knew everything about beekeeping you could know.
So Peace Corps made a really good choice to send him to a place where he could really benefit people,
right,
and not be a
risk to himself. Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, that's good. Absolutely. That's good to know.
Yep. So at the end of that day, we were all assigned to our host families, and Antigua's, of course, now is particularly it's a tourist town. At that time, there were not a lot of tourists because of the political situation in Guatemala, but still there was tourism. And so the Peace Corps Center, the training center, was on the north side of town, and we were all assigned host families on the south side of town, up on the slopes of the Volcán de Agua, one of the volcanoes, yeah. And so every day for 3 months we would walk all the way through town, spend the day at the training center and then walk back.
How long would it take you to walk down?
About an hour.
An hour?
Walk, yeah.
Oh,
it was a good walk. Yeah, it was a good walk. Every now and then somebody would get a ride, but for the most part we just walk.
Mm-hmm. What was your host family like?
Oh, they were wonderful. They were wonderful. I mean, it was...
Were they thrilled to have you?
I don't know that they were thrilled. I think my host mother, she was excited about it. My host father was very nice guy, but he worked his butt off. He had a carpenter shop there in the house, and he was a farmer. They raised vegetables. He had a truck farm. So he was hardly ever around, but they had, I can't remember, probably 6 or 7 children.
Wow.
Living in a house that was probably not even 1,000 square feet.
And you were there too?
And I was there too. But,
Did you sleep in the middle?
It was no, that was the thing. I mean, it was like maybe a 4-bedroom house with all these kids, and I mean I think the oldest child was a daughter. She was maybe 17, and the youngest was still suckling his mother.
Oh,
So
wow.
they were spread out pretty good. But so it was probably a four bedroom house maybe, but little bedrooms. But I was given my own room. Because it was
Oh, yeah.
they were paid. The family were given money from Peace Corps to provide
Right.
food and to host this. So I think my host mother was happy about that. That certainly helped her family. And no, they were so sweet to me.
Were they very interested in America? Did they ask you a lot of questions about?
I don't remember. No, they were. I was more, especially for the children. I was more a source of entertainment.
Uh-huh.
In trying to speak Spanish. And of course, they got better over time. But those kids would just laugh. They just laugh when I would try to speak Spanish to them. But they helped me out a lot.
Did they help you with your language too?
They did. Yes.
They did.
My mother not so much, but the oldest daughter helped me with the language, and then the smaller kids, they'd come into my room and they'd want to talk all night, and I'd ask them questions, and then they'd laugh, and then they'd say, no, you don't say it like this, you say it like that. So absolutely, they were very interested.
Oh, that's neat. That's neat.
Yeah, it was a very short time, but I still have very vivid and positive memories of that.
What did you learn beyond during the 3 months? What was the most important stuff other than language in that setting?
Sure. I think learning about just kind of the daily rhythm of life, right? Mm-hmm. That they didn't have the kind of amenities that we have in an American home. No. My family did have running water in the house, but it was one spigot outside of the house, and they have what they call a Killough, which is a big concrete basin. So they fill up that basin, and that was the water, right? Very basic toilet facilities.
Would they bathe in that basin?
Yeah. Well, not in the basin, but they draw it into another tub, and they would bathe in the courtyard there. Yeah. And of course, they didn't have a gas stove. They cooked on fire. And things like host mother having to make tortillas every day, so going through the whole process of grinding the corn, preparing the masa, letting it sit overnight, making the tortillas in the morning for the next day. Going to the market, not going to the supermarket once a week, but going to the market 3 and 4 times a week.
Did they grow a lot of their own food, this family?
They had chickens. Like I said, they were farmers. They grew vegetables, radish, beets, turnips, cabbage, things like that. And so we had fresh vegetables in the house, which was nice.
Yeah.
But no, I mean they didn't bake their own bread, for example. So they thought, oh, he wants bread. And I quickly learned, well, tortillas are good with me. That white bread, I can get that in America, but these tortillas are good. But yeah, I mean, they go to the market much more frequently here. They buy smaller quantities, but go more frequently.
Where they get the money to buy this stuff?
Well, like I say, my host father was a carpenter, pretty good carpenter, I guess, and then he had that farm that he ran part-time as well, so that were their 2 sources.
So he would sell whatever he raised.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think in that community, I know they were well respected because they had people come into their house all the time. But I think they were in that community at a pretty good standard of living. Mm-hmm. Now, compared to town there in Antigua, they were considered poor. Like I said, they didn't have a stove, they didn't have a gas stove or anything like that. But I think that was the most interesting part of the host family experience, was just learning from them and seeing how their life plays out on a daily basis, and what's important to them, and seeing the strength of family and the church community in their life.
Were they religious people?
They were Catholic.
Catholic?
Yeah, they were Catholics.
They went to, do they go to daily mass or just weekly?
You know, I don't remember, because like I said, we were leaving the house like 6:30 in the morning probably to get down to the training center, and then we'd get back about 6:30 in the evening. So, you know,
So you didn't really know what was going on there?
Yeah, they were long days
Yeah.
at the Peace Corps Center, and I think we,
12-hour days?
I mean, when you include the hour,
Yeah, well,
the
you
hour
have
plus
to.
that it took us
Yeah.
to walk both ways, or to walk either way. So yeah, it was close to 12-hour days. But no.
So when the day was over, you were probably pretty exhausted.
It was a tiring time. Plus, the other thing that happened was that we, you know, later on during the training period, we learned that Peace Corps. So, a couple things we learned. One is that the year prior, so that would have been '82. You know, just as a reference point, Father Rother was killed in '81, July of '81, I think it was.
Yeah, I forgot.
So in '82, and I met some Americans that were working in Guatemala later on, and they say, yeah, '81, '82 were the worst times. '83 was not good, they said, but it was even worse. But what had happened the year before, Peace Corps, as the violence had been mounting, and as it had been targeting more indigenous communities, Peace Corps decided that they were going to pull all of the volunteers out of the indigenous areas and reassign them to the mostly Spanish-speaking areas of the country. However, our group, they said that they were going to select 5 or 6 from our group that they were going to use as kind of like guinea pigs, pilot test, to assign some of us sites in what was called the Alta Verapaz region, the northern central part of the country, which is indigenous areas, and they were going to assign a few of us up in this part of the country. Well, everybody wanted that assignment because everybody wanted to be part of that.
That's right.
But they said, you know, you've got to have really good, strong technical skills, which I knew I had.
Yeah.
I was teaching some of my volunteer associates about, you know, how to do this and how to do that, and
Right.
Because of my previous livestock experience. So I knew I was solid there, but I knew I had to do well in the Spanish, because they said these 5 or 6 that we're going to send up to this area, they're going to be the best Spanish speakers in the group. So I worked very hard to really get my Spanish up to a level so that at least I'd have a chance to get to go up there. And as it turned out, I was among that group. So
Oh,
there were 3, 4, 5 of us.
Uh-huh.
5 of us that were sent up to that part of the country.
This was right after the 3-month training?
Right,
Yeah.
right. So what they did is actually during, I think it was, we'd been there, I think we were maybe like a month away from finishing the 3-month pre-service training. They told us most likely where our site was going to be. And then we had a 1-week site visit. And so then we were given assignment of things that we had to do, you know, go visit the market, go meet with your counterpart agency that you were going to work for, inquire about housing, where you might live. So, you know, it was kind of a checklist of things to do. I remember one of the things on that checklist, which was kind of striking. You know, the other things I understand, you know, you got to learn where the market is and all that. But one of them was you need to draw a map of the community, and you need to designate an area of town where we could land a helicopter to get you out of the site if necessary. Did you have to do that?
No.
No?
No. So you did that?
So we did that, yeah, we did that.
Huh.
We did that. But so we went up, so we and again, at that point in time, we weren't guaranteed that site, but that was most likely where we were going to be. So we were gone for a week, and then we came back for about another month or so to finish up our pre-service training. In my case, well, as I said, I was this group of 5 that were sent back, and we were sent to, there were 4 different towns, and I would say the closest one was about a half-hour bus ride, public bus, away, and then the furthest one, we were probably about 2 hours apart. So we were relatively, centrally located in terms of being close to each other. But in my case, I was assigned to, as I found out later, it was the largest municipality in the entire country in terms of area. And so myself and another volunteer were assigned to that site. So I had somewhat of a unique Peace Corps experience compared to many other volunteers that I know and have talked with, in that myself and another buddy were shared the same site.
Oh,
now, we didn't live together. We had separate houses and we had separate lives. I worked for the Livestock Extension Agency, and he worked for the agricultural extension, the horticulturalists. Basically, they mainly help people with gardens, and so our lives were quite different. But we'd see each other obviously in town and spend time together.
And you were very good friends, I guess.
Very good friends. Very good friends. Still are.
Ah.
Still are. Oh, yeah.
You want to tell me who that is?
Sure. His name is Reed. He was a little older than, he's a couple years older than I was. As it turned out, I was like one of the youngest in my group, as you can imagine, because I graduated university in spring of '83, and in December I'm in Guatemala as Peace Corps volunteer, well, as a trainee. But yeah, he was a couple years older than me. He was from central Pennsylvania, kind of a country boy like me, and had graduated. I don't remember what his undergrad degree was. He had gone to Bucknell University, good school, and kind of kicked around, did some things. If I remember correctly, he's the youngest of like 4 brothers, and so his parents were just glad he was doing something with his life, as he tells the story.
Well, I think that would, I can't even imagine being with another volunteer in the same community.
Yeah, yeah. In our second year of service, we got a 3rd volunteer in town. She came in, and she worked as a fish culture volunteer, aquaculture volunteer.
Oh, okay.
And that's a whole other story. And I don't know if you've ever heard this story or not, but at one point in time, around that time in the mid-'80s, Peace Corps training had a very intensive, even before the in-country training, they had a very intensive technical training on aquaculture, how to raise fish in ponds and all that. And it was down here at the University of Oklahoma. It was here in Norman.
Wow.
Yeah. But as I found out, especially when this volunteer came and started living in our same community, the people that ran that program, they thought they were drill sergeants apparently, and so they ran it like boot camp. And so many of those volunteers had really negative experience. I mean, they showed up in the country and they were grumpy, and they hadn't slept. I mean, they would tell stories about how they'd come in at 4 o'clock in the morning and throw buckets of cold water on them and say, "Oh, you gotta go check your ponds." It's whatever degree. I mean, the temperature has dropped and you need to go check your ponds. That kind of thing. It was not necessarily a positive experience by any means.
It was stupid.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there was, but aquaculture was going on. I wanted to ask you also, you mentioned Father Rother. How far was where his church and community was that from you?
It was quite a ways. It was around the Lake Atitlan area, which is kind of in the center of the country. So yeah, it was. I mean, we got used to talking about distances in terms of hours of bus
Time,
ride.
time,
Yeah,
right.
hours of bus ride. So it was probably about a 6 hour ride. I mean, it was about from our site down to Guatemala City was about a 3 hour bus ride, and it was probably another 3 hours up into the west. It was in the western highlands of the country, they called it. So yeah, it was a ways away.
Were you hearing about him?
I did not. I didn't hear anything about him.
Never heard
Never heard
any,
any.
the whole time you were
No,
there?
no. What we did hear about, was that Americans of different stripes, had been targeted and were being targeted. And I came to find out years later when I after my Peace Corps service, I met a fellow by the name of Roland Bunch, who Roland used to work for World Neighbors. You probably know World Neighbors.
Oh, I do. In fact,
NGO.
I'm doing volunteer work for him now.
Right, okay. So Roland was the regional director for Central America, or Mesoamerica, I think they called it. And he was working in Guatemala. He'd married a Guatemalan, was living there, had kids, I think. And the story he told me was that, and so he was doing community development work, right? He was working with farmers, farmer trials, improving their agriculture, but it was community oriented. I mean, they were organizing farmers, training farmers, connecting farmers, etc. So it was very much community organizing in both the positive sense and in the sense of people who don't view that so positively and the undertones of what that could mean, right?
Yeah.
And so he told me later that he was living and working in Guatemala, and one time he went into Guatemala City, was walking down the street, and he accidentally ran into somebody that he knew from the U.S. Embassy. And this embassy official was like, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Oh, well, I'm in town. I got bought some supplies or whatever, brought his family shopping. I don't know what it was." And he said, "I thought you left the country." And he said, "Well, no, why would I leave the country? This is my home." Yeah. He said, No. He said, "You're on a list. You need to leave the country."
What list?
A list. And he did. He left.
Meaning that he was marked by terrorists.
No. Most likely by paramilitary groups of the government.
Oh.
Yeah, because they don't know. In the case of Father Rother, there's never been a full investigation and a clear verdict but a clear outcome of what happened, who he was killed by.
Yeah.
And the government said it was guerrilla terrorists, and the opposition said no, it was not us. It was paramilitary forces of the government. So yes, the embassy official said, "No, you need to leave the country," and he did. And so when we were there as volunteers, we knew that the Peace Corps associate country director and the country director both, they regularly were in the U.S. Embassy getting security briefings, and were pretty. I mean, I'm sure the U.S. Embassy didn't share everything that they knew about what was happening in country, but they were kept informed of security risks in country. And Peace Corps was usually pretty good about keeping us informed as well. I mentioned earlier we were this group of 6 or 5 that went to one of the indigenous regions of the country.
Yes.
So what we were told in training, you'll get a visit from your program director, who's Guatemalan, right? Your Guatemalan program director. You'll get a site visit from them about every 6 months, right? They'll come and they'll see what projects you have going on, and they'll give you advice, and and if you need to get in touch with them, well, you can come make an appointment in the office, so you can have more regular contact with them and interaction with them, especially if you need help with a project or whatever. But in terms of them visiting your site, once every 6 months. Well, they met with the 5 of us before they sent us up to the Alta Verapaz region, and they said, "We're going to come and visit you every month for the first 6 months."
Yeah, I can see why.
Yeah, and they did. Yeah, they came up every month, and it was good. I mean, it was good. We had the Guatemalan staff for Peace Corps at that time, and probably still today, but they were fantastic. They were professionals. They were easy to work with.
Were these people who had been PCVs themselves?
No, they were all Guatemalans. They were nationals. Yeah, they were nationals.
Okay.
The only American staff for Peace Corps Guatemala at that time was the country director, who didn't want us there.
Yeah.
The associate country director, who had been a volunteer in Guatemala a few years before, and he wasn't that much older than we were. He was probably in his early 30s. Really great guy.
So he's the guy you'd seek out, right?
Yeah, he was a great guy.
Yeah,
he was a great guy. His name was Howard Lyon, and
Lyon.
Lyon, and he went on and had a career with Peace Corps for 40 years. He just passed away just a couple years ago. Great guy. In fact, they had to, because for many years they had a rule that you could only after Peace Corps service, you could only work for Peace Corps Washington or Peace Corps country program for 5 years, period of 5 years. Then you'd have to do something else, right?
Uh-huh.
So 5 continuous years. But they kept inviting Howard back they sent him to Bolivia. He went to Nicaragua a couple of times, and it lined up that he was breaking that rule, so they had to change it, and they called it the Howard Lyon exemption.
That's good. That's good that they did that.
But no, he was a great guy. And then the only other American on staff was the nurse, was the Peace Corps nurse, Kathy.
So she was your medical care.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You could go to see her if you felt sick.
You could go to see her if you felt sick. You had to go and see her once a month.
Oh.
Yeah. She gave you
For
vitamins.
an exam?
Well, she would give you your vitamins, your malaria medicine, and she'd give you your B12 shot in the butt.
Okay.
To keep you from getting hepatitis and other things.
I guess you didn't seek out the country director who
Not
didn't
too
want
much.
you there.
Not too much. He didn't stay much longer. He ultimately, again, I'm not going to mention his name, but he did ultimately go on to become the president of the Inter-American Foundation. And he was a good guy. I have a lot of respect for him, but he was in a particularly bad mood when he showed up in Miami for us.
It took it out on you guys.
Took it out on us.
Yeah.
But he didn't scare too many of us away.
No, that's good.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're in this indigenous. Did the indigenous community? Would that be correct?
Yep, indigenous region. Yeah, because there are many. There are like 35 different indigenous languages in Guatemala. Guatemala is the size of the state of Ohio.
Oh, that helps.
It's not very big.
Yeah.
Right. But it's extremely diverse. Agroecologically, it's diverse. It's one of the most diverse countries in the world because you have beaches to snow-capped volcanoes. And then language, there's like 35 different tribal and indigenous languages. So it's quite diverse.
And the indigenous languages are quite different from one another.
Some of them are similar, but yeah, there's a lot of diversity. Yeah, they're very different.
So what were you learning to speak in this
Right.
place?
So we were all, one of the reasons why they wanted the better Spanish speakers that were going to be assigned to this region, 2 reasons. One, they wanted to be sure, because these were areas where there was conflict. And so they wanted to be sure that we could speak at least hopefully talk our way out of any difficulties.
Yeah.
But the other reason was they said, as soon as you get to your site, you're going to have to start taking, in our case it was Quechua, was the local indigenous language. And
How do you spell that?
Kekchi.
Okay.
Quechua. And so they said, you're going to have to take Quechua lessons. So, three of the 5 of us were the better Spanish speakers, right? They were in that top class that I mentioned before. They had Spanish going into the thing. But there I was.
I think I'm going to have...
there we are, but particularly me, I'm having to start taking language lessons to learn a third language, but the lessons are in my second language that I've just recently acquired, right? So it was a little challenging.
Yeah.
And as I say, three of the other colleagues who had to do the same thing, their Spanish was already much better, so they did a little better along the way. In fact, and so for the most part, those of us who learned the indigenous language, we studied and worked hard enough to get to a level to where we could function in the community, right? To do our technical business and to conduct our projects. One of the five guys, oh my goodness, he, as they say, he went native, right? I mean, he really learned the language.
I know what you mean.
Yeah, and the local language, and was extremely proficient at it. The rest of us were, we were kind of slackers, I guess, but enough to get by.
Yeah. To get by, meaning you could have conversations with people.
Get directions.
Yeah, I mean more than directions. I mean.
Yeah, right. But I mean, yeah, right. You have a conversation. You could conduct a learning session with farmers to teach them, whatever it was you were.
Well, that's
to
pretty
teach
good.
them.
That's pretty proficient if you
Yeah.
could do that.
Yeah.
That's what you're there to do.
Well, yeah, but that doesn't always go right. So all of the Guatemalan indigenous languages are tonal languages.
What do you mean by that?
So by that meaning the word, you can look at a word and it may have four different meanings depending on the inflection of the tone. If it's a rising vowel or a lowering vowel. So I remember one of the very first times I've been studying Quechua a little bit, and I met this Catholic priest, Father Jorge, who was from India, actually. Just a great guy, but he was really interested in community development. He was really interested in livestock production. So he and I became friends, and he was supporting me, and I was supporting him, and we were working together. And so he came to me one day and said, hey, he said, I'm going to bring in 60 of the women leaders from throughout the community for a 2-day session next weekend. Mm-hmm. And I'd like for you to give them a little, presentation on raising chickens.
Yeah. So
I said, okay, sure. So I started studying, preparing my presentation, and in Quechua, right?
Yeah.
So I'm ready. So I get there and I'm nervous as heck. Of course.
I bet.
But I knew I had one ace up my sleeve. My name is Scott. For Spanish speakers, I was Escot. So it's just a Spanish pronunciation of Scott. But in Quechua, cot means shit.
Shit?
Yeah. So, my icebreaker is I introduce myself, I'm Mr. Shit. So, of course, that gets a laugh, So then I said, well, this is why I'm here for. I'm going to do this, and we're going to talk about this, and whatever. And then I said, how many of you have ever raised chickens? Raise your hand, mm-hmm. Right? And they looked at me, so I repeated the sentence, and then they started laughing. All these women started laughing, right? And the padre, Father Jorge, he kind of nudges me and he says, you just asked them how many of them have raised their skirt. I said, oh yeah, okay, sorry, Father. So yeah, Quechua is a difficult language because it's tonal, so you can, same word, but it has different meaning if you pronounce it one way than if you don't. So. But no, Father Jorge was really great. I felt very fortunate. So I was assigned to work for the Guatemalan government, the Department of Agriculture, specifically their livestock extension service. And so the
livestock extension.
So basically, if you think about a county extension agent in the U.S., someone who's
but you need to explain this because there'll be a lot of people watching this
Sure.
who don't know about
Sure.
extension agents.
Sure. So as a livestock extension agent, I'm you know, working to go out to meet with farmers and, you know, individually, sometimes in groups, sometimes meeting with community organizations to help them with their livestock production. And up there in that part of the country, almost everybody had chickens. Almost everybody had turkeys and ducks, so lots of poultry, fowl. Almost everybody had 2 or 3 pigs. And a better off farm family might have a beef cow that they were raising.
Yeah.
They might have a dairy cow, because that was a part of the country where you could raise dairy cattle because it was wetter, the feed was available. And it was a good place for goats, but nobody liked goats. Because goat was considered to be a poor man's cow, and so nobody wanted to raise goats. So I
That
pushed.
was a cultural thing?
It was a cultural thing, yeah. So I pushed. You probably saw that in the Philippines as well. Similar, no. So you know, I pushed goats because goats were very practical. You don't need to feed them a lot. They'll give you milk. They'll give you meat. They'll give you manure. They'll give you hides. But I didn't have a lot of takers on goat production, but got a number of small-scale pig production, you know, raising pigs for both to farrow, to raise young pigs, but also just fattening hogs to take to the market. And then a lot of chicken projects. Laying hens, broilers for meat, very small scale, you know, 20 birds, 30 birds, something like that, really small scale. But that was very popular, and what I really enjoyed about working with the chickens was that I was working with the women, working with the mothers, because they were the ones usually, typically in the household, they were the ones that were responsible for the chickens.
Right.
And the men were more interested in the cows and the pigs. And but it was really empowering because the women were like, oh, okay, now all of a sudden I can raise my own eggs, or I can raise hens that, you know, broilers that we can to eat the meat, or we can take 2 or 3 down into the market and get some money. And so it was a very, very exciting kind of project for them. So we did lots of that as well.
And they understood that you were working for the Guatemalan government, not the U.S. government.
Yes, they did. I mean, whether they did,
job.
Whether they did or not, you know, that you don't know. I'm sure there were some people who thought that I worked for the U.S. government. Maybe
the CIA.
Well, there was always that accusation, wasn't there? Yes, there's always that accusation. In my case, so in the town where I lived, they had a very small. This government agency had a very small office. It was basically me and one other guy. It's a young Guatemalan guy. He was not from that area of the country. He was from a totally different region of the country, but he was young. He was a go-getter, and we hit it off. He and I did, and you know, we got to become pretty good friends. And we worked hard. We worked our butts off. And he was ambitious, so he wanted to do well. And he saw me, you know, this young volunteer that I didn't know a lot, but I was willing to work. And so I remember that first year, I don't remember how, I've got a record in there. Still have a record of my first year of service.
Oh, you do?
How many chickens we vaccinated, and how many pigs we castrated, and how many this and that, you know. And anyway, so at the end of the year, he had to do a tally, a report, you know, annual report. So he and I sat down, we worked on that for a couple of days and put it all together. And then he went to the provincial capital a couple of days later, and you know, made his presentation. He didn't invite me, so I didn't go, so I wasn't there. But he came back, and he was mad.
He was what?
He was mad. Oh. He was angry. So he came to my house, and he was angry. I knew he was mad. And I said, well, what happened? And he said, he said, I'm so mad at those guys. He said, I showed him our report, and they called me a liar. I said, what do you mean? He said, yeah. He said, they told me that there was no way we could have done all that work. I said, all those numbers are right. Otto was his name. He's like, I know they are, but he said, oh, I'm so discussed it. So he was pretty aggravated
Wow.
about that.
I would be too.
Yeah, he was, you know, like I say, you know, he had a more of a long-term interest in that whole effort than I did. But he and I worked well together, and
But didn't you take that kind of personal?
I didn't.
When you've done all this work and now they said, no, you didn't really.
It was definitely disheartening. Yes, it was disheartening, and it may be a little unmotivating as well.
Did you want to have a say with these people? Did you want to seek 2 or 3 out and say, look, I want to go over this with you. I heard you don't believe this.
I think I did because I knew the regional director, and he was a pretty good guy. Later on, he became the provincial governor for the province, and I met him years later when I was doing my PhD research, because I did PhD research in Guatemala. And but no, I mean, I wasn't that worried about it. As I said, my counterpart was more upset about it than I was, because by then, by the end of that first year, I had made a couple of other connections where I was able to do work. So I was still working for the government agency, the Extension Service, but I had met this Father Jorge that I mentioned earlier, and he was just super excited. He wanted me to work with him and go on vaccination campaigns and, you know, start new projects and all that. So he had lots of things going on, so I could stay busy there.
Yeah.
And I had met another, through my counterpart, had introduced me to another government program. It was called Community Development Program. It was a new program, and it was supposed to be kind of an interagency collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
And so I met some of those people, and they were very enthusiastic. They're like, well, hey, you know, if you don't want to work with DSEPI anymore, the name of the agency, hey, come and work with us.
Oh,
so I was
great.
still officially assigned to this government Ministry of Agriculture Livestock Extension Service, but I was, you know, offering my services and providing my services to many other agencies that were very happy to have me work with them.
What did Peace Corps think about that?
They were fine with it. They were fine
Great.
with it. Yeah, oh yeah. No, they
Very supportive?
They were very supportive. Like I say, my program officer was just a really great guy. He later became Minister of Agriculture for Guatemala. For the whole country. In fact, it was the year after I left. In '86. So it was towards the end of my service. He aligned him. Well, he wasn't really politically interested, but they held in '86 or '85. In '85, they held the first democratic elections in Guatemala in like 30 years. It was a big campaign, and so the very popular Christian Democratic candidate, Vinicio Cerezo was his name, he won. Well, Vinicio somehow knew my boss, Rodolfo Estrada was his name. I think they'd known each other at university or something. And so he asked him to become his Minister of Agriculture. And so he did. He left Peace Corps service, although I think he did go back maybe years later and continue to work with them. But he became the Minister of Agriculture.
And did he do a good job?
He did. He did a good job until he took, and this became the basis for some of my PhD research. He took. I mentioned earlier that I had not extended for a full third year, but I'd stayed on for another 6 months or so to complete this paraveterinary training. And Rodolfo, my boss, who was very supportive of that program, and we even got some money from the U.S. Embassy to, you know, do the training and buy little veterinarian kits for these farmers that we were training. And when he became Minister of Agriculture, he nationalized that program. So he set up a program within the Ministry of Agriculture where they did that across the entire country and really scaled it up. And so that was one big thing he did. He got into trouble a little bit later on when he proposed that, as Minister of Agriculture, he proposed that the government should put in place a what he called a production tax. So he said that the idea was, if you own land, agricultural land, and you're working that agricultural land, you know, you're farming or you've got cattle or whatever, fine, that's great. But if you have agricultural land holdings and you're not working it, we're going to tax you. Well, the wealthy, elite agricultural families in Guatemala did not like that program.
No, I guess not.
So he quickly met some opposition and ultimately did end up leaving as Minister of Agriculture. He went on to work as in the Guatemalan import-export industry, and was a very well-respected professional in Guatemala, but he didn't like politics.
Now, I'd like to ask you if you were attracted to any particular Guatemalan female.
Good question. Yes and no. I mean, yes, you know, young man, new environment. And you know, Guatemalan women can be beautiful. So I did have a small involvement during my Peace Corps training, but that didn't last very long.
With a Guatemalan?
Guatemalan, yes, Guatemalan. It was a sister of one of the Spanish teachers, and so we met at a party, I think, or something. So you know, we went out for a while, but nothing really serious. And she was pretty young, and I think was even still in university, so that didn't really last. And but no, other than that, really not. When I was in my site, the Quechua language teacher that we found, she would have been very happy if any of us, if any of her pupils, American gringo pupils, would have expressed interest in her, but none of us did. But
because you could have brought her back?
Possibly, but she was very flirty during classes. Let's put it that way.
Oh.
Yeah. But no, other than that, no. And throughout my, you know, a lot of, as you know, in Peace Corps circles, a lot of volunteers start relationships, a lot of them end relationships and move on, whatever. I really didn't do that. I was kind of considered as too serious. I was kind of a serious, I was very serious about my Peace Corps job, and I enjoyed it. I think partly because I realized, you know, I went to Guatemala, as I mentioned earlier, as, you know, kind of an adventure. This is going to be an adventure. But I very quickly realized in my service that, hey, this is a possible career. You know, this is real jobs. I mean, there are professional people that do this.
This is the first step.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is the first step. And so I realized that. And so a lot of my volunteer friends would be like, well, I can't wait till I get back home, and I'm going to do this and do that and whatever. Yeah. And I was like, well, I want to keep doing this. And I did. You know, when I came back from Peace Corps, I went and got a master's degree at Cornell, and have had, you know, a 30 plus year career working on international development. And so even in Peace Corps, I was kind of pretty serious about the work. And I mean, I had fun, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
I went to Peace Corps parties and had a lot of fun. But I knew really early on that I want to learn as much as I can and figure this out, because this is something that I'd like to keep doing.
Well, I think you just answered my next question, which is, did you ever get in trouble?
Did I ever get in trouble?
Yep. And I mean real trouble.
We could have got in real trouble. And this story is one, yeah. So I never got in any serious trouble where my life was in danger.
Okay.
Well, I was mugged one time in
You were
Guatemala
mugged?
City. Yeah, Guatemala City. They took some money. I was had a few drinks, probably more than a few, and was with some buddies, and so yeah, we were held up, but no big deal. They had a knife or something. I don't remember. It was pretty low key.
You weren't struck?
No, we were not attacked.
Okay.
No, they just held us. They just pointed a knife.
Give
at
me
us
your
and said,
money.
Give me your money. Yeah,
And did
so-
you do it?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
We probably only had a few dollars.
Yeah.
I mean, as volunteers, we earned the equivalent at that time of $100 a month.
Uh-huh.
And you think, oh, that was nothing, but we lived pretty well.
Yeah.
$100. I mean, because you convert it to the local currency, and the cost of living was cheap. I think I rented my house for $12 a month. And I had a nice house, pretty big house. But no, that was the only time that I recall being in any kind of personal danger. There was conflict throughout the region, but at that time, in the early '80s, El Salvador was in active civil war, and so there were very few rules for Peace Corps in terms of safety and security. One was if you ride a motorcycle, and I was assigned a motorcycle by my my government agency. Yeah, it wasn't much of one, a little Honda 100, right? But if you are provided a motorcycle by your agency, you always have to wear a helmet. Okay, I'm good with that rule. Yeah, that makes sense.
Uh-huh.
And then there was one section of Guatemala City that you weren't supposed to go to because it was dangerous. We went there several times.
Because it was dangerous?
Because it was dangerous.
And because you were told not to go there?
Well, that's part of it, yes. And then the third rule was you are not supposed to set foot in El Salvador. So we are several friends. We're in Guatemala City, and it's around Christmas time. And, we're there to see friends and, party, whatever. And so we're sitting around the hotel where we used to stay, this little pension house, and listening to the radio, and we hear an announcement in Spanish, of course, that the El Salvador government and the guerrilla forces of El Salvador have declared a 3-day Christmas ceasefire. And they're both taking it very serious. The ceasefire will be observed. So naturally, one of us came up with the idea, let's go to El Salvador for Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
So we did. So we next day we got up, got on the bus. It's like a 4-hour drive, whatever. Got to San Salvador, the capital city, and we're gonna go to the beach. But we got there too late to get to the beach that night. But we figured out how to get there and all that, and found a hotel. And so the hotel owner said, "All right." We said, "Where can we get some pupusas, which are an El Salvadoran delicacy? It's basically tortillas, but they put filling inside it.
Uh-huh.
They're very good. But we wanted the authentic ones from El Salvador." So he told us a place, and he said, "But you see that gate?" And there was a big metal iron gate in the entrance to the pension house. He said, "There's a curfew. It's 9 o'clock, and we close that gate, and we lock it, and we don't open it for anybody. You need to be here by 9 o'clock. Well, we were, although barely.
Barely?
Yeah. Got to the beach, had a good time, and a couple days, on the beach. And El Salvador was even cheaper than Guatemala was.
Uh-huh.
And then it finally sunk in, what are we going to do? Because we have a El Salvador visa in our passports, an entry visa, and we're about to get an exit visa. And we're going to have to turn our passports into the Peace Corps office every so often so they can renew our Guatemalan courtesy visas that we had.
Yeah.
They're going to see our visas. Oh no, what are we going to do? So there were 3 of us, so we thought about that.
Because Peace Corps said you don't go to...
You don't go to El Salvador. So we thought about it on the bus ride back, and so finally we came up with a plan. All right, whenever the next business day was, because it was the holiday, we'll go in and we'll go talk to Howard Lyon, assistant country director. So we went in, we showed up, and when the 3 of us walked in, Howard knew something was up, even before we had said anything, right?
Uh-huh.
So he said, "Hey, you guys, what are you doing here?" "Oh, we've been in Guatemala City for the holidays and all, but, we're about to head back." And he's like, "Okay, well, what can I do for you? So we sat down and we said, well, we were here in the capital over the holidays and we got mugged and they stole our passports. And he said all three of you were together and you all had your passports because you weren't supposed to be walking with your passports, right? Because we had little Peace Corps ID cards and so the whole thing is sounding fishy. So he says, I'm gonna give you a minute and you guys think about this and is this really your story?
Were you laughing or were you...
Well, no, we were serious. Because he could have sent us home. But we knew if there was anybody who wouldn't send us home, it was Howard.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, he didn't send us home. And we did get new passports.
So you finally told him the truth?
Years later, we did.
Huh?
Years later.
Oh, years later.
Yeah, years
so how
later.
did you extricate yourself from that then? He was going to give you a minute to come up with the real story.
And we sat there and we looked at each other and none of us blinked an eye and we said, no, that's the story, Howard. Because we knew he might not even be able to keep us from getting kicked out of on that offense. Right?
Uh-huh.
We could have said, well, no, so-and-so saw me riding a motorcycle not wearing a helmet, but so-and-so saw me and I had my helmet on. So, it could have been he said, she said thing, but physical evidence of the passport with a El Salvadoran entry and exit visa. So, no, we didn't do that. But no, we did see him years later and we told him that story. He said, I knew you guys were full of crap the minute you walked in my office.
Oh, that's great. Tell me about some of what you believe were your best accomplishments in your service in Peace Corps.
Well, I've already mentioned that we did a lot of work. I did a lot of work and was very, very proud of that and learned a lot and enjoyed every minute of it. I think a couple of things. I think in terms of the work. I've mentioned already a number of the very small livestock production, chicken projects, pig projects that got started, and that was very satisfying to see families benefiting from that. So that was one. I think the bigger one was, and I already mentioned it, was this Peace Corps wide program that we started, and I wrote the grant proposal to get funding and. But it was this paraveterinary training program that we started. And so we got some money from the U.S. Embassy, and we brought farmers from all over and trained them 3 or 4 different locations, and did that. And many of those farmers, went back to their communities and they were providing paraveterinarian services. The veterinarians were not so happy about that.
I guess not.
But most veterinarians in Guatemala at that time, they didn't care about vaccinating chickens, right? They were more interested in the bigger cattle, the larger scale cattle production.
Where the money was.
Where the money was. Yeah. All right. So we were really filling a niche for them. And there were even a couple of the senior veterinarians in the Ministry of Agriculture that were part of this agency that we worked for, who were very supportive of us.
Did you get the money for the project from that agency?
They probably, yes, I know they provided some money or some counterpart things, I don't remember, but we were the ones we were the impetus to get it started. We had talked to them about it and they were like, yeah, that's a good idea. A couple of the veterinarians. One was in my region, another one was down in the border region close to El Salvador, really a great guy, Guatemalan. And they're like, yeah, that we would work with you on that. They warned us that some of the private veterinarians might not be so happy about it, but then we were the impetus. We wrote a small proposal. We got, I don't know, maybe $5,000 from the U.S. Embassy to get the project going, and then our program director got some things donated. I think some medicines. He got some medicines donated, but yes, that government agency did chip in as well on that project. Okay. And so yeah, we were. That was a very satisfying moment. Like I said, that became the reason why I lengthened my stay. I didn't extend for a full year. But I went to Peace Corps and said, hey, we've got this project going on. I'd really like to see it through. And they were like, yeah, that's fine. You're a good volunteer. They
So that's all it took. You didn't have to write out a proposal or anything for extending?
I don't remember. I think I had some kind of paperwork that had to be approved.
Was there a finite limit to this or not?
I really don't remember. What I do remember is when I went and talked to Peace Corps about this, they encouraged me, well, why don't you just go ahead and extend for another year, right? But I said, no, I don't want to do that because I already had some plans for what I would do when I returned back to the U.S., and so the timing would have been off, and so they were like, okay, that's fine. They were, I remember they were flexible with me, and yeah, I think I filled out some form of some sort, but it was not a formal extension of a third year. That if you're going to do that,
and you don't remember them trying to talk you into a year?
I do, yeah. I mean, that they were like, well, why don't you just stay for a year? And I was like, no, that's not going to work with my plans to use my readjustment allowance.
Yeah. I bought a car with mine.
Did you? Yeah. I did too. I bought a truck. Yeah. I bought a truck, came back to the U.S., and one of my best friends, and I moved to Boston. His family lived outside of Boston, and we spent about 6 months painting colonial homes.
Now that wasn't your plan, was it? You didn't not extend so that you could go to Boston and paint colonial homes?
It was. So what happened? It was. What happened was that this friend of mine, who still is a very good friend, unfortunately his health is not good at all, his father came down to visit him. And his father had been a teacher, and growing up he had his summer job had always been painting homes. Mm-hmm. And my friend had, when he was young and was a teenager, he'd helped his dad out painting homes. So his father came down to Guatemala to visit his son, and this buddy of mine said, why don't you come over and have dinner with my friend? So I took the bus. It was a couple hours away. Spent the night, had dinner with his dad. We drank some beer, and in the conversation, his dad was like, what are you guys going to do after this, right? And that was like a year away still. And we said, well, neither one of us had a plan at that time. So he said, well, I've retired. I just retired from teaching. I wasn't going to plan on lining up any paint jobs for next summer, but if you two will come up, I'll line up some paint jobs, some house painting for you. So that's what we did. And
I don't quite understand. You described how being in Peace Corps was a great thing, and you considered it a start of your international career.
Right.
And the first thing you do when you come back is you paint houses?
Well, there was a slight wrinkle, a couple of slight wrinkles in that. One is that I had already decided that I wanted to go to graduate school, mm-hmm. but I'd have to apply and all that.
Graduate school in what?
International agriculture.
Okay.
And but I was going to have to do the application and figure out where, and even save a little money. And my buddy told me, he said, we can make a lot of money painting houses. And so I said, okay, that'll be great. And then the other was, you asked earlier about Guatemalan girlfriends. Well, by that time, I had a Peace Corps girlfriend.
Oh, you did?
A fellow volunteer.
When you say by that time, what time do you mean?
This was like towards the end of my service.
Okay.
Yeah.
Of your 2 years?
Of my Peace Corps, yeah. Of the 2 years, yeah.
All right.
And so she and I were already talking about going to graduate school. She also wanted to go to graduate school, but we were about the same age. I think she was maybe 2 months older or whatever, but we were essentially the same age, but she had started her Peace Corps service a year later. So she was like, well,
she's got another year.
Yeah, I've got another year of Peace Corps service, so you figure something else out to do in the year. So painting houses was part of it.
Oh.
And we made really good money, because I mean, we were painting, it was a fantastic experience, but we were painting, you know, houses that were built in the 16, 1700s, right? Old colonial homes.
I think I've seen the
Yeah,
ones that
yeah.
you probably were
Yeah, I
painting.
mean, and you know, it's a lot of work. We worked our butt off, but
Yeah.
good money. I mean, it was like 10 grand a house back then. It was serious money. So,
So what happened between you and the?
well, so yeah, so we worked up in Boston. We lived in my friend's the basement of his parents' house, and then in November of that year, I went back to Guatemala and applied for a position as a Peace Corps trainer in the training center, the technical trainer for the livestock program. And so I remember my girlfriend at the time was still a volunteer in Guatemala, but she said she went and talked to Peace Corps and talked to found out some information of who was going to do the next training group.
Mm-hmm.
So she got me in touch with them or gave me the information. So I called they were based out of Chicago. I called them and sent them an application, resume, cover letter, and all that. And they said, well, yeah, I mean, you look good and we would hire you, except the program director who we've hired that's going to run the training program, he's already told us he won't hire anybody that he hasn't interviewed himself.
That he what?
That he has not interviewed himself in person.
Okay. Okay.
So they told me, we can send your resume down there, but we can tell you right now that's not going to get you the job, even though you probably would be very well qualified for the job. So I said, so what you're telling me is I need to buy a plane ticket to Guatemala? And they're like, yes. So I did. I bought a ticket, went down to see my girlfriend, interviewed for the job, and got the job.
Okay.
And so I did that for about 6 months, and then that gave us the time to apply to graduate school and figure out a plan and all that. And so then I did graduate work at Cornell University in International Agriculture, Rural Development. And then she did a master's in public health at Columbia University.
In New York?
In New York, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the public health school there. Mm-hmm.
All right. Mm-hmm. What did you do during this time as your service? Well, not your service, but you were in graduate school, and you were getting a PhD or a master's?
No, at that time it was just a master's.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a master's in international agriculture and rural development, and you know, I mean, I'd never been. Well, I mean, I'd been east of the Mississippi, but not very far.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly had not been to the East Coast. So.
So it's an adventure, too.
So it was an adventure, yeah.
Yeah.
Though, you know, I'd been up to Boston. I'd spent that time up in Boston, and I enjoyed my time up there. But there were two schools that I looked at. One was Cornell, which was very well known, very prestigious.
Right.
The other was the University of, it was the California Polytechnic School at San Luis Obispo.
Yeah.
Which also had a really good international agriculture program. And but I had, you know, talked to people at both schools, even visited Cal Poly. I did not visit Cornell before I applied and got in, but went out and visited the folks in Cal Poly and talked to them, and they told me, they're like, you know, those are both good programs, but the Cal Poly program is much more production agriculture, right? We'll teach you how to run tractors and that kind of thing. Cornell's going to be more of a different entry level point. And but the deciding factor was the fact that my girlfriend was applying to Columbia in New York City, so I went with Cornell.
Okay.
Yeah. And then at Cornell, yeah, so I mean, I was a full-time student, lived there, you know, rented a house and did the whole grad school thing. As I mentioned earlier, I was very fortunate to be able to be given the Peace Corps recruiter assistantship. So I worked for a year on campus as the on-campus Peace Corps recruiter, and I loved that job. It was just really great.
At Cornell?
At Cornell, yeah. And just met some really great people, young people who were excited about Peace Corps, and as you can tell, I can talk about Peace Corps. So,
Did you develop a kind of confidence that would give you a good impression about whether or not the people you were talking about would make good Peace Corps volunteers?
I certainly felt I did, yes. I mean, I certainly felt that, and again, I had, you know, volunteer counterparts from Guatemala who had not been happy, right? So I certainly did not feel that I had a, you know, rose-colored perception of Peace Corps service. I mean, I had some, especially female volunteer friends who had very negative experiences. They were constantly harassed by, you know, the machismo that's very very prominent in that culture. Who had very frustrating experiences. I had, you know, some volunteer friends who had very frustrating agency experiences, you know, during their volunteer service. Because at that time, now Peace Corps, you can be assigned to a nonprofit organization in country, right? That can be your host country agency or nonprofit organizations, and many volunteers do work for nonprofits. At that time, at least in Guatemala, that was not the case. You worked for a government agency, and so, you know, they're bureaucratic. They're disrespectful of your contribution, like the example I gave earlier. So I had volunteer friends who had, you know, less than positive Peace Corps experience. Man, when that 2 years came up, they were ready to get back home.
Yeah.
And so I felt when I was, you know, sitting on that side of the desk at Cornell University as the Peace Corps recruiter, that I had a pretty good sense of what the experience could be, both good and not so good, and had a good sense of who could make it, you know, based on the intangibles. You know, you can always look at somebody on paper and say, yeah, this is going to be an excellent candidate for Peace Corps service. Yeah, they might struggle, but it's the intangibles, I think, that help someone to transform their Peace Corps experience into something that that makes a difference in their life and the people the people that they serve, rather than just, you know, showing up and partying in country for 2 years.
So you must have felt like, well, you gave Peace Corps a recommendation on everybody, right? Who came into your office and applied?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So as the recruiter, so then I worked very closely with the office in New York City. So I was basically an extension of the Peace Corps recruiting office in New York. They're on Manhattan.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would, my responsibilities were to, you know, to talk to anybody who wanted to come in. So I had office hours, you know, and I had posted office hours. And so people could just walk in and ask me questions, or they could walk in and ask for an application, or they could walk in and tell me about themselves and did I think they were a good candidate, you know, everything. But so then I would conduct the initial interview in person, help them to fill out an application, and then, then I would forward that application with my recommendation to Peace Corps. And then to the office in New York. And then the office in New York, they had what they called a placement officer. And actually a year after I finished grad school, I worked for a year at that New York Peace Corps recruiting officer, not as the placement officer, but just as a regular recruiter. But in that office, there was maybe 6 or 7 recruiters, and then one who was assigned the placement officer. And their responsibility was to know what Peace Corps was looking for in different country programs, and then work with the individual recruiters to say, okay, Peace Corps is looking for 3 positions to work with the Ministry of Tourism in Mozambique. Who have you got? Right?
Yeah.
And then the placement officer was the kind of the final approval to push it on up.
Okay. Now you and this girl, did you get married?
No, we didn't. No, we dated all through grad school.
And then went your separate ways.
Well, and you know, and so one of the reasons why so, you know, I'm in Cornell, I'm thinking, all right, I'm going to go get a great job, you know, with somebody overseas. Mm-hmm. And both of us, she was also interested in doing international development work, getting a master's in public health. and we had forged a pact, I guess, that whoever gets the first job and it's the better of the jobs, you know, the other one will follow.
Yeah.
Knowing that people like ourselves, once we're in country, you can find
Move around. Yeah.
other opportunities, and so we had agreed to do that. But she decided during her grad school time to start doing some work. It was actually innovative work. I mean, she was working with what was called the Gay Men's Health Crisis, which was one of the organizations at the forefront of the AIDS crisis in the late 80s in New York City. Yeah. So it was very, kind of cutting edge kind of work. And so she wanted to stay a little longer. So I said, well, they're offering me, because they did. They're like, oh, you recruited more people as an on-campus recruiter than anyone ever has in the history of Cornell University.
Wow.
And I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's good. So the
meaning you recruited them, you recommended them,
and they got placed. Yeah. So I had a higher percentage from recruitment to placement
terrific.
Than anyone had. And so the boss who ran that DC office, Trevor was his name. He's a good guy. He was like, "Why don't you come to work for me in New York?" And I'm like, "No, thank you very much, Trevor, but we're going to go back overseas." Well, when the plans of my girlfriend changed a little bit, she's like, "No, I'd like to spend another year in New York." And I said, "Okay, that's fine. They've offered me this job. I'll call." I told him no, but I'll call him back and see if he's still available. And so I called him and he said, "Oh yeah." He said, "We'd love to have you come work." So I lived and worked in New York City for a year as a recruiter as well. Yeah. So I've seen Peace Corps from all sides.
Yeah. You sure did.
And my most recent Peace Corps role has been being the father of a Peace Corps volunteer. Because, whatever inspiration I may or may not have given my daughter,
obviously gave her the right kind of inspiration.
Graduated from Oklahoma State a few years ago, and also with a liberal arts degree and a minor in French. Well, she didn't actually get the minor in French, but she had some university French, and so she was inspired to join and was a volunteer in Benin in West Africa.
Okay. That must have been thrilling for you.
It was. Oh yeah, it was exciting. Yeah, it was great.
Did you raise her kind of like, I don't want to be overbearing about this, but I do want to have my say.
No, not at all. Not at all.
No, you weren't like that.
No, I mean, I think the biggest attraction for her was, so when I graduated from Cornell, spent the year in New York working at Peace Corps, and then my first post Peace Corps job was I got a job for a not-for-profit organization. It was an American organization actually, but it was based in the Philippines. So I went to the Philippines, and
what was the corporation?
It's called the International Institute of Rural Reconstruction. It's a not-for-profit organization based in New York City. And so I get there, and
were you in Manila?
We were about an hour south of Manila. If you know where Cavite is.
Yeah, I do.
Silang. Do you know Silang?
Yes.
It was in Silang, Cavite, right along the highway on the road to Tagaytay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And so I got there, and this organization, this nonprofit, as it turns out, they were doing quite a bit of work, kind of cutting edge kind of work on sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture, reducing external inputs, soil, organic matter.
Yeah.
And so was involved in that kind of the beginnings of that program. They had already started, but my coming in, we really grew that program, and that kind of took off. But the organization had a partnership with the Department of Agriculture Philippines, because they're called departments like we are, not ministries. And so I went to a meeting and saw this young woman who came in to facilitate the meeting, and it was love at first sight. So a couple years later, I did get married. But anyway, I lived and worked in the Philippines for that organization 17 years.
17 years? You
Yeah.
worked in the Philippines for 17 years?
17
I
years,
didn't
yeah.
know that.
Yeah, yeah,
Wow.
yeah. And so
All in Cavite?
in Cavite, yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. And we have programs. We have programs in Pico. We have programs in Mindoro. We had programs in. Uh,
Any up north?
no, not much. We did do one aquaculture project with freshwater eels, and collaborated with Benguet State University out in what's the big city in the north?
Baguio.
Baguio.
Yeah.
Baguio, outside Baguio. Well, yeah, yeah. So, but anyway, so my, my children were around that kind of community work, nonprofit work. My wife, like I said, she was the coordinator.
Her name?
My wife, Emmeline, when I met her, she was the coordinator for the Department of Agriculture's national program on family food production. It had UNICEF funding. So yeah, so she grew up, I think, with that ethic of service and giving back to your community. So I think it was.
So that it was all around your
Yeah,
kids.
yeah, it was all. It was all. Yeah, I mean, their playmates were the children of my professional colleagues, right?
Yeah.
And so it was. Yeah, it was.
So were they born in the Philippines?
They were. Yeah, yeah. All my kids were born there. Yeah.
Huh. So they're Filipino and American citizens?
Filipino and American citizens, but they were culturally they're really Filipino because they were high school age when we moved back here to the U.S. And so
Wow, that's something.
yeah. That was not a strategy I necessarily recommend, to pick up your three teenage high school age children and move them to the other side of the world. But they did well, and they continued to do well. And,
Well, anything that you were wanting to tell me that you haven't gotten to, or that slipped your mind earlier?
Well, no. I think the interview guide that you had, the questions were really excellent, and I'm glad you didn't follow the one that the other colleagues sent you.
Yeah.
Right? Question 1, question 2. But I think the one part of my Peace Corps experience that still lives today is the connection that I have with many of my volunteer associates, my friends. I mean, they're people who have well, they didn't come to my wedding because I got married in the Philippines, but they would have been there. I've been to several of their weddings, right? We've raised kids not necessarily together because we're all spread out. Most of them live back east, but my kids know who their kids are, and we've gotten back together occasionally for reunions, family reunions.
Mm-hmm.
We still, there's a group of about 6 or 8 of us every year. One of the guys hosts a gathering in his condo outside of DC there, and we go for a weekend in the fall. It's a football weekend, so we all get together and just watch college and NFL football games over the weekend and drink some beer.
Sounds good.
And so I think that's and I would never have thought about that going into the experience, right? Because I had good friends from high school. I had really good friends from college, and I certainly wouldn't have thought that the Peace Corps experience would also lead to what I consider to be some of my best friends. But it certainly did. So,
what about people from Guatemala? Have you kept up with them?
a little bit.
That you knew
A little
when
bit.
you were there?
A little bit, but not much. Not much. I mean, I'm Facebook friends, with my counterpart, my livestock extension agent buddy. I've been in touch with some others. I think I briefly mentioned. So while I was living and working in the Philippines, I had an opportunity to pursue PhD studies at the University of Reading in England, and so I did. I went to did a PhD research, and the topic of the theme of my research, the topic of my research was that I looked at this idea of farmer-to-farmer extension, that it's not just extension agents who can share information with farmers, but that farmers themselves can be sources of innovation,
Great
sources of new
idea, yeah.
ideas, experiences of what works and what doesn't work. So
Within a framework, right?
yeah, I mean, with some guidance, yes,
Yeah,
obviously.
okay.
And so I designed a PhD research project, and I gathered data in Guatemala. I looked at this program that the Minister of Agriculture, my former Peace Corps boss, had started, did some work in Nicaragua and in Honduras. And so when I went back, and this was in the, mid-90s, I guess, when I did that field work. And so when I went back, when I was working on designing that and figuring out what I wanted to do and who I wanted to talk to and all that, many of my former colleagues, Guatemalan colleagues, I got in touch with them, and they were like, "Oh yeah, come on, it would be great," and opened up their files and shared information and shared contacts that helped me to do that piece of PhD research. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, okay. I think that might wrap it up for now.
Very good.